Hi everyone, I'm here for my stakeholder presentation. I'm starting off with this quote that says, "That is, the problem is not that we do not know how to make schools better, but that we are fighting among ourselves about what goals schools should pursue." And that was from the Public Schools, Private Schools, the American Struggle Over Educational Goals. And I'm starting with that because the stakeholder group that I'm choosing today is politicians. And we are constantly going back and forth about what we should focus on in education. So we are not going to be able to be successful in education if we can't pick a common goal or theme. So I'm starting off with politicians and their viewpoint on education. And I've learned very quickly that it depends who you're talking to. It really depends on which political party you are focusing on. So I kind of broke this apart into Trump and Biden, and then I also looked at what Obama's formal education secretary said. So Trump's administration supports various schools of choice, focusing on homeschooling, charter schools, and private schools. He has a real deep thinking that if we put a lot of attention on those schools, that will help our country thrive. He's also decided to try and cut the educational budget by 13.5%. One of his quotes said, "Trump's most prominent comments on the issue of testing came during his 2016 presidential campaign, where he singled out U.S. students' relatively mediocre performance on international exams." So, as you can tell before, if we are focusing on other different types of schools than public schooling, if we are cutting school budgets and we are focusing on the fact that our school performance is mediocre, we are obviously having a negative outlook on education and the school. And we are not meeting the purpose, which is for government and political purposes, it's to create a society that's going to create lots of a higher economy and a great workforce. Biden has said, though, I quoted him, he said, "And any charter school that is in fact worthy of being an education would have to be accountable to the exact school boards, the same exact mechanisms that a public school is accountable to across the board. There has to be transparency." And I do agree with that. I think that it's a good idea to focus on public school systems because they are who is catering to 86% of our population. And he also wants to triple Title I funding, which I can come back to a little bit later. But that is one of my hopes that we can try and move forward with. So by tripling Title I funding, we are going to be able to cater more towards our lower socioeconomic status groups. And I got this information from the Education in the 2020 presidential race. So as you can see, Biden kind of has a more positive look on education and is saying that there are things that need to be done, but this is what we should do. And on the other hand, it seems as if Trump is saying that we're failing in education, but I'm going to cut your budget and not give you what you need to be more successful. So this was from the video, "What does the former Secretary of Education say about public schools?" And I took the very first quote that happened in the video and it said, "If you were to grade our educational system, what would you give it?" And he said, "Incomplete." We rank 30th in the nation. College complete, we are 12th through 15th. We're somewhere in between 12th and 15th in the world. We have a lack of political will. No one is held accountable to education. And he's blaming the voters. That means that people are showing that we have problems in education and they're noticing those problems, especially politicians and our governors and our mayors, but no one's being held accountable to, okay, our graduation rate is only 80%. How do we get it higher than that? And he's kind of blaming the voters that the citizens are not voting for the correct people. The next thing says the divides between the haves and have-nots. That means our country has a serious divide of who's going to get what they need and who does not, and who is not going to be able to pursue a farther education. It says here, education should be the equalizer. That means everyone should be able to have the same amount of education and get the same amount of educational experiences. Not breaking cycles of poverty. That's a huge problem because if you think about education and segregation and systematic racism. And this goes back for a very long time, that students, for when they go to school from day one, they are already, depending on their race and their socioeconomic status, will depend on how well they do in school. And also he made a comment that we value our guns more than our children. So he obviously is showing that we have many different areas for improvement, but he was really prominent that we as a society should focus on one common goal to reach for in education, not pinpointing every single thing that's wrong. So how can we change your viewpoint? We have all of our politicians are, everything's horrible. So what can we do to make you seem like education might be doing something actually positive? So I'm going to take you through schools from the past and then today. So the purpose of school is much different in the 17th century. So Puritans realized that they needed school to teach academics and also their religious values. They wanted students to be able to read in order to read the Bible. In the 18th century, we kind of turned schools into private, and we had Ivy League schools that were really catered toward just men, and religious schools. And some of those Ivy League schools are still available today. Again, in the 18th century, Thomas Jefferson requested that educational program should be funded by taxpayer dollars, and that was denied. It was kind of overlooked until the 19th century. But up until then, school was free, so everything was donated. The communities really were working together. As you can see in the 19th century, public schools, As you can see in the 19th century, public schools, that's when we started having those books and our slates and chalkboards and one teacher per classroom, but with many different ages, many different abilities. We had the communities would come in and they would help build the desks. They would help tend for the horse that the children had to ride to school. The teacher lived and would move from house to house in the communities, and they would take care of the teacher and they would feed the teacher and give them a place to sleep. Students were required at the time to attend school just until they were 14 because they were supposed to be ready to work with their family. Then we reached the 20th century where we are focusing on segregation. We have schools for students of color and schools for students who were white or Caucasian, and they were separated. And I think that this is saying separate but equal is really today not fair to say, because we were separated and the education and what they were receiving at both schools was not equal. So today, we have schools where everyone is together. So you are rarely ever going to walk into a school that does not have students of color or students of a different race or of a different religion or ethnicity. Students are separated now today by age, ability, and by their grade. You see lots of technology in school, and that's to help them get ready for their workforce and in their future jobs. We also have vocational schools, and those help focus on specific skills, and then leave schools with certificates that they can begin working right away. So a lot of those type schools are great for students who would like to become a mechanic or even beauty school. So I'm going to focus on now, what's the purpose of school? Why do we go to school today? And there's two different types of functions that we go to school. We have manifest and we have latent functions. So I'm going to start with manifest functions, and those are the obvious reasons why we go to school. So we want to learn facts about the world. We need to read. We need to write, math, socialize with our friends, to learn the norms and values in our society, to learn civics and history, and that will hopefully help our students learn how to be a better citizen. Having social integration, so that means that you can understand people who are different than you and hopefully have you become a more accepting person of others. Schools create new knowledge through research. They educate the future workforce, and you also get educational credentials, like your diploma that says that you graduated high school and you are able to go get a job. Many jobs require you to have a diploma from high school. Latent functions, which I found this really to be interesting, is that there are many functions and reasons we go to school that aren't intended to happen, but they do. They give us an extra reasons to go to school, like how to become a 9-to-5 worker. Children go to school every single day from the morning until the afternoon. Now, when they go to work, once they graduate high school or college, they won't be too shocked by what does it mean to work somewhere from the morning to the evening time. Schools are in a factory school model. They aren't really unnecessary anymore, but they were before. Rows and not talking, having authority figures, and things like that. School also provides childcare for parents, which in turn can help the economy. Schools help you make friends, create social groups. You can find your romantic partners at school, and it also has order and stability of society. So it allows us to regulate that children should be in school and people and others should be working during the day. There are 3 goals in education that I received from the public goods, private goods, the American struggle over educational goals. And there was 3 that was taken from the book, from the story. The first one is democratic equality, which is preparing citizens. The next one is social efficiency, which is how do we train workers. And the last one is social mobility, which is compete for social positions. So how do you compete for a job in the future? So all of these purposes, how do you benefit the politician? How do you benefit from these purposes in school? For starters, a huge aspect in schools that we are training workers. We are training them how to be a 9-to-5 job. We are giving them the facts to be able to be competent in their job that they choose. And if we train workers, we create more opportunities for people to get jobs and to be more skilled to have those jobs. And in turn, it makes the U.S. more competitive in the world. As we can see earlier, that was something that was a huge stressor in education, that it was educational's fault and their problem that we are not as competitive in the world. And an also benefit is it allows for parents to work while their children are learning. And if their children are at home, parents can struggle to find childcare, which in turn can keep them from going to work. If we keep our parents home and not keep them working, then our economy will suffer from that. So what can you do to help? How can we come together as educators and politicians and find a common ground together? So what should we be focusing on? My first thing I said was equal funding. How do we get all schools to have equal funding? Because if we base funding based off test scores, we have those communities who score really high, then they get these great payments from the government. But then we have our lower socioeconomic status groups who don't do well in the test but continue to not get funding. So in this type of situation, the higher always gets high and the lower always gets low. But then if we flip-flop and say the poorer you score on a test, the more funding you'll get. Then you'll see across the nation that students and schools are not trying their best because they know that they'll get more funding. So how do we make this an equal playing field for all? To kind of up the ante for all schools and all children. We need to focus on poverty. How do we focus on getting people out of those communities that they're in, finding them jobs and supporting them? Because we have so many students that come to school with these ACE scores and these traumatic experiences in their life because of where they are living. And because of that, they come to school already at a lower rate than somebody who did not go through those experiences or who lives in a rural or more rich, you could say, area. So how do we focus on poverty? In schools and in our communities, we need to have a more equal representation of culture and races. That way we are looking at each other as one. That way we can kind of strive away from these different communities that have only a little bit of these different schools that have not that much representation of different color and different religions and races. And then we need to also educate the older generations. Things are changing. Things are new. And it's important to have older generation support, and we need to make sure that they are aware of what these changes are and what needs to happen.